Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 495th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, an events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Esther Adler, Randall Morris, Mark Pascale, and Lyle Rexer on the occasion of Joseph Yoakum, What I Saw, on view at MoMA until March 19th. We are thrilled to welcome poet Carolyn Funk here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat in just a moment for living document of resources and actions. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication art, music, dance, film, theater, and literature, along with thoughtful social and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we need your support, and your contribution will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and all of our operations here at the Rail. Please check the chat for more information and links to donate. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Curator and author Esther Adler is curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Museum of Modern Art. Along with Mark Pascale, Édouard Kopp, she is co-author of Joseph E. Yoakum, What I Saw, published by Yale University Press in 2021. Writer and independent scholar Randall Morris is co-owner of Cavin-Morris Gallery in New York. With his partner Shari Cavin, he has specialized in non-mainstream art since 1980. Particular areas of interest have been visionary artists from the African diaspora, particularly Haiti, Jamaica, and Asia. Curator Mark Pascale is Janet and Craig Duchossois, if I got that kind of right, curator of prints and drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago and senior lecturer at the School of the Art Institute. He has organized exhibitions on topics ranging from the Harlem Renaissance to artists' ephemera. Along with Esther Adler and Édouard Kopp, he is the co-author of Joseph E. Yoakum, What I Saw, published by Yale University Press in 2021. And independent critic, curator, and writer, Lyle Rexer, is the author of The Critical Eye, 15 Pictures to Understand Photography, Intellect Limited 2019, The Edge of Vision, The Rise of Abstraction in Photography, and others. He has contributed to such publications as the New York Times, Harper's, Art in America, among others. He teaches both the graduate and undergraduate programs at SVA. And we're so thrilled to have these guests here with us. I will now turn the mic over to Lyle, our lovely host. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. I want to thank, obviously, first of all, I want to thank the staff of the Rail for organizing this, Nick, Ty, Eleanor, and the whole group. It's been a really astonishing series of broadcasts, and I would urge everyone to go into the archive. It's been a great project, and there are just amazing things there. I want to thank our guests, especially Mark and Esther. They've just done a wonderful job on the show. It's historic certainly for Randall and I, who've been waiting for a show like this for decades. It's been exciting to see this really beautiful show. We should put some pictures up on the screen here, just to give a little bit of the flavor of the exhibition. I wanted to say a couple of other things about it. As I said, Randall and I have been waiting for this I've been waiting for decades. And I was especially interested to have Randall as part of this discussion because his work or his piece that he wrote was a short piece for a catalog for a show back in, I think, 1989 at John Ullman Gallery. Was the first piece I read about Yoakum's work. It was called Animistic Landscapes. It was a short catalog essay. And I've been thinking about Yoakum ever since, trying to understand what it was I was seeing and why this work is so important, so special. And so it's really nice to kind of have all this group together. It's a remarkable group, and we've got a lot to talk about. We'll see how far we get. I think there's some just astonishing things that can come out of our experience of Yoakum's work. But I wanted to start on a more personal note for all our guests. And I did this when we talked about Martin Ramirez a few weeks ago. I'm very interested in your individual reactions to the work in the sense of how did you come in contact with it? It's not work that everybody knows. In fact, even people in the art world are quite experienced. Probably many of them will never have seen the work before. So I'm interested in personally, if you can recollect or you can talk a little bit about your kind of initial experiences with the work and what struck you about it and why it was worth committing to on your part. I suppose Randall's a good place to start with you because, you go back probably further than anyone with the work. You have to unmute though.
How's that?
That's better.
I think there was sort of a perfect wave around the year 1980. And, we got Bert Hemphill's folk art book. There was the show in Washington of Black folk art, the Corcoran. And also we had begun a friendship with John Ullman. And I actually got to handle the work for the first time. And I saw that the work was actually, if I could understand and know what Joseph Yoakum's work meant, then it would be a door to understanding a lot of other stuff. So I approached it from two directions, as works of African-American spirituality and as masterful examples of American art brut. And it was really interesting to me to find out where his work fit in the nexus point of those two things. Yeah, so I would say it all started with that. It began with a bang.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, Mark, I'm really interested. I mean, you're in Chicago. I don't know how long you've been there. I haven't sort of dived into your biography that carefully, but I'm very interested in, because we think of, or there's a lot of talk about Yoakum as a Chicago artist. I'm very interested in your connection to his work and how that struck you, especially as a drawings curator.
My experience of it was as an artist visiting the Princeton.
I think we lost Mark for a moment.
Yeah, did
maybe I'll go, Lyle.
Yes.
Maybe I'll go while Mark is coming back.
Esther, the same question for you. I'm really interested from the MoMA side and your interest in Yoakum's work as well, obviously.
Sure. So MoMA has a long, often problematic, sometimes lovely history with self-taught artists and their work. So that part of the collection has always been of particular interest to me, and being in the drawings department is actually where a lot of it lives. So I was in some ways primed to be kind of aware of this material. And I also, in general, really love highly worked drawings, like things with a lot of line, a lot of celebration of line, essentially. So between Yoakum's kind of incredible mark making ability and the fact that the work was was not typical. For MoMA, it had this kind of self-taught bent. I have always been kind of super interested in it, but had like so many questions. And I had Daryl DePass's book on my shelf for like years, and I kept being like, oh, at some point I'm gonna like dig into this. And then I hope Mark will come back and join us, because he's really, for so long, he organized a show from the Art Institute's extensive holdings in the 90s, which he has a
That's
great
right.
story about.
Yeah.
And so it was really, you know, they have an incredible collection. He could have done this show 3 times over just from the Art Institute's holdings. And it was really through, I think, his generosity and also a desire to like make Yoakum, both to acknowledge the incredible history in Chicago, but also to expand the dialogue beyond Chicago in some ways, which was exciting to look at. So it's really through his advocacy and generosity that this particular show happened. But I think MoMA got its first Yoakum work in 2004, and then like randomly we had shown a few drawings in what was essentially like a selling show, one of these things we used to do in the members' dining room where people would
right,
make,
yes. Yeah.
And if you look at who he's showing with, it's like Mel Bachner and Jack. I mean, it was literally like, this is stuff we have right now. So I don't know that it was organized with a particular theme in mind, but his name just came up in this extremely kind of random context here. And one that I think spoke to kind of this ongoing interest where people are super into the work, but don't totally know what to do with it.
You know, it raises a question for me, and this is maybe a broader way, and I think there are a number of different answers to this question, but I'm really curious about how you see this. We've been looking at this work for a while. I mean, certainly Mark, Randall, and I have been looking at it for decades. And, you know, my question is, quite apart from the fact that, okay, there's an opportunity and there's collaboration, and why Yoakum now? I mean, this work's been around since 1970 or since the 60s. And obviously it's been circulating through a bunch of different channels, mostly through folk art, to some degree, as Randall was alluding to, kind of art brut or outsider art, kind of more extreme forms. But I'm really, really interested in the moment of the show. That is, why now? Does Yoakum have something to say to us that we need to pay attention to, particularly at this moment, sort of historically speaking? I'd be interested to see if you guys have any thoughts about that.
I don't want to be a mic hog here, but I guess I'll just say from my perspective and in terms of the thinking we've been doing about MoMA's programming, Yoakum is someone who's engaged with kind of like it maybe not issues that he necessarily spoke forthrightly about during his own life, but issues like the natural world, issues like personal identity. Obviously, there was a whole lot of information about his process, his working process, which is something we're always looking at now closely with our conservators. So there were a lot of things that felt extremely relevant to our moment and things to be explored, but that hadn't been done with the kind of full weight of, you know, an institution that's set up to like stick all this stuff under the microphone. I mean, I think Mark's amazing conservator at the Art Institute looked at probably every single drawing in this catalog to figure out like what kind of paper, what kind of, you know, pastel. There was all this like really specific information that I think helped shape the way we perceived how he was working and the kind of dedication to the work. So there was a lot of, I don't know, there felt like a lot of opportunity to kind of do that kind of digging.
Yeah, I want to come back to a lot of those things you're talking about, ways of working in particular. Materials, we see in the show things like the notebooks, which are absolutely essential to understanding kind of who he was, how he worked, what he was thinking. But I want to go back to Randall for a minute. And, you know, do you have a particular thought? You know, I think we mentioned this to each other the other day. You said, oh my God, well, it's about time. And I wonder if there's something very special about the time we're in right now that allows Yoakum to speak to us in ways that, you know, maybe are a little bit more, you might say, have broader implications. I'm just curious about your sense of the moment for Yoakum.
Well, I think it's actually a golden moment in the field right now, in that there are people interested in this work who have never been interested in it before. It's sort of a perfect wave, again, of things going on. And we're starting to realize that there is not a lot of scholarship in the United States. There's a lot more in Europe, but not here. And we're starting to see these things in perspective. There haven't been a lot of amazing discoveries in the US in the last few years. So we're starting to look at what's already there and realize that it goes beyond what we've already known about it. So I think that it's just natural in terms of the exposure that the work is getting, that more people are going to be interested in it, and that it's going to attract scholars. And the fact that we don't really know a lot about many of these artists. I mean, you can have a million things about Trailer or Ramirez, but ultimately there's still mysteries remain, and it's those mysteries that make the whole thing interesting.
I hope Mark can come back in on this, because, well, both Mark and Esther, I think, have been really instrumental. Yeah, in terms of exactly what Randall's talking about, which is looking again at the things that are right in front of us, but being able to apply the kinds of attention, techniques, contextualizing that's been missing from dealing with this work in the past. And when we talked about Ramirez a couple of weeks ago, we alluded to some of the problems of sort of interpretation in that regard, that it's been too easy, especially with Yoakum, simply to say that he's a sui generis artist, that there's no one like him, and that he exists in kind of his own world. And that own world is something that it might appeal to you and it might not. Might seem too extreme, or it might be completely unfamiliar. But it's really a matter of personal choice, because the language of his work is so personal. You know, it really doesn't, in that sense, mean anything. I think the catalog in the show is, of course, gone an enormous distance to beginning to overturn that. But I did have another, is Mark back in the house? Did Mark manage to get back in? He's back, okay. So I wanted to ask a question about, well, Mark, I mean, I'd like to hear from you about this, but I have another question specifically for you, if we can jump to that. One of the things that the show does, and talks a lot about, and I think it's just very interesting, is it tries to place Yoakum as a kind of Chicago artist. And there are a number of essays in the catalog that deal with different aspects of that, let's call it his identity, or part of his identity. And Mark, I wonder if you talk a little bit about Chicago and that environment, both how it might have shaped Yoakum at all, and about the ways in which his work began to circulate in that place. And Eleanor, of course, you can talk about it. Esther, we can talk about this as well. I'm just interested in the Chicago part. And I wonder if you could clarify that for us.
I can't say that Chicago had any effect on Yoakum as an artist. He seems like he arrived fully formed, and he moved here from other places, and just right. he resided here at the end of his life. However, his reception was very much made possible by his presence in Chicago, in part because Chicagoans in general were highly sensitive to being receptive to what he had to offer as a unique vision.
Why was that?
That goes all the way back to Juba Fay delivering his anti-cultural positions lecture at the Arts Club of Chicago in 1951. Mm-hmm. And there were artists present at that lecture. The so-called Harry Hugh artists were not old enough yet, but their predecessors were. And Whitney Halstead, who was their professor, was there. And so I think that the kind of training that they got, which was very open-ended and didn't rely entirely on the Art Institute's collection, that is to say, largely Western art, was embedded in them. And so when they saw the work, they were prepared. I mean, they all were working on a kind of interior image that they tried to conjure, but they had a lot of training, and they saw Yoakum's work and they thought, here's a guy who's just doing it. And so they were very attracted, and they encouraged it, and they encouraged other people to be interested in it. And I think it kind of blew out from there. So I wouldn't call Yoakum a Chicago artist necessarily, but the story is very focused in Chicago because that's where people discovered him.
Yeah, Esther, did you want to add a perspective to that? Because I've got some more questions of that. I don't want to beat this horse too much, but I'm interested in how you read let's call it the enfranchisement of of the work by artists in Chicago and by that whole group?
Sure. So I've been quite fortunate, in fact, to work with Mark and a number of its colleagues at the Art Institute before on a lot of on some projects focused on artists who came up in Chicago in the early part of the 20th century. And for me, there are, and again, I've never lived in Chicago, so this is all through a admittedly limited and very personal, a kind of research-oriented type focus, but there are very clear lines sometimes, or what appear to be clear lines drawn in Chicago that for me often stand as a perfect example of what's going on across the US. It's easier to kind of parse out communities and the way communities intersect or don't intersect at various points through that lens. And of course, there's so much great artwork coming out of that moment, or all of those moments in Chicago. And it's also obviously someone working in New York at an institution that's historically been looking like, you know, only here, if we make it out into the outer boroughs, we're doing well. Looking to Chicago in particular has felt like a discovery for me, which is silly to say, it's like not exactly that far. But so for me, that interest in Chicago as kind of a microcosm of what's going on elsewhere has been really critical. And for Yoakum, like the fact that he was essentially living and working in what's now, I think, the part of the South Side that the Esther Gates is developing and working on in lots of ways, and in this really like storied African-American community where there's so much kind of creative energy at the exact moments that Yoakum is there, but like he's completely both either unaware, either by choice or not. I mean, we're not really clear of like what's going on closest to him, but is in fact connecting with these incredible artists in other parts of Chicago, and the fact that these communities like have no intersection, and in some ways aren't even aware of each other. I mean, to me, in like the current global minute where everyone's on like Instagram, you know, like you can see stuff everywhere. So that thought of really seeing very clearly how you could have two incredibly driven, creative groups of artists who had like no idea what were going on, you know, in each other's communities, even in the same city, was super interesting. And to think about Yoakum even as an additional layer to that, as someone who's in neither of those camps, but also kind of being bound by these camps, was really interesting.
Yeah, Randall, good thought about this.
I think that you could see it also as Chicago was his home, but the South was his home ground. And I think you have to make a differentiation there. And that, you know, I always wondered, what if there had been a Black imagist to speak to Yoakum and how that might have changed things as well. But I think also in this country, I mean, you see it in Columbus, you see it down in Georgia. Whenever you have universities and art programs in universities, you could almost draw circles around those universities and see artists that have sort of been visited in the environs of those universities, and it's a natural phenomenon. And I think Chicago wasn't too different like that. There were that Yoakum may have been living there, but I don't think, you know, I think, and I'll show more as we speak more on it, but I think he very much related to his African-American home ground more than he did to what was going on per se in Chicago.
Yeah, for sure. And that comes up as a problematic in the catalog. There's a really interesting essay by an artist from Chicago who wants to investigate exactly those issues about Yoakum's identity or his sense of identity, where he located himself within these communities. But I wanted to make reference to something that you both mentioned, and that is this idea of the outsider. And within very specific communities, because it seems to me, if we talk about Columbus or Chicago, or to some degree places like Washington, not sure about Detroit exactly, but I suspect that may be true as well. It does seem to me that the white artist, or let's say the educated artists working in those milieus, usually connected with universities, may have a sense of their own outsiderness that, in a sense, encourages them to think maybe a little bit more broadly. again, we're in a different time now because the art world is so globalized and because kind of students learn the same thing, whether they're at SVA or whether they're at the Art Institute of Chicago or whether they're at, you know, the San Francisco, you know, School of Art. But that idea of artists, again, especially trained artists, thinking about themselves in relation to these very unusual people like Yoakum, and kind of making a connection that I keep thinking otherwise might not have been made. You know, again, it was so special in Chicago, really important in Columbus. Those are the two places I know best. We can talk about it being a kind of a very selective enfranchising done by essentially middle class, usually white artists who have, in a sense, brought into the fold artists who are usually artists of color, who were not being recognized, who were in some sense in different communities. Is that problematic now, or can we begin to think about all these things in ways that are a little more productive? I think in the past, they've been largely ignored, those kinds of interactions.
I guess I would say that, I mean, to me, what's important is actually to, in some sense, take the judgment out of it and to look just very frankly and factually at what the relationships are. I was in a panel last weekend for the, actually 2 weekends ago, for the American Folk Art Museum, and I spoke about Yoakum, and Valerie Castle-Oliver spoke about Sister Gertrude Morgan, and another extraordinary scholar from Minnesota, who's Jennifer, whose last name I'm blanking on at the moment, spoke about Edmondson, and all of these artists of color were discovered by white patrons isn't totally the right word, but so we had kind of a discussion about the ways in which that affected both the artist and the reception of the work now. And for me, the key difference here is that Yoakum's discoverers were artists. And there was no, like, they weren't dealers. Yeah, they weren't dealers, and there wasn't an immediate monetary interest in the work for them. Mark, you'll let me know if I'm misstating this, but to me, that's actually a critical difference, which is not to say that any kind of involvement of a market or money is necessarily wrong. I mean, yes, Sister Gertrude Morgan's work was certainly pushed by or promoted by a dealer, but he also, you know, allowed her to make a living and kind of support herself through that. So I think in some ways, it's important for me to lay out what the dynamics are, and then if possible, to talk to either the artist or, in the absence of the artist, the person on the other side of that, which is also something we were really fortunate to be able to do in this case. And Mark, I will say the lion's share of that. Mark, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Well, actually, I think that initially, Yoakum's work was presented by a dealer after it had been in the coffee shop or a coffee house. And that was a relationship that soured because of his misunderstanding of the way that relationships with dealers and artists work. And that is to say that the dealer got Yoakum to sign an exclusive contract, which he didn't realize he was doing. And then when when artists contacted him and asked to come visit, and he allowed them and then started selling out of his storefront, there was a problem between Yoakum and the dealer. And in the end, Yoakum was exploited in a way by the only way he could get out of his contract was to forfeit what he said was about $15,000 worth of his drawings. So without that relationship, and of course, the kind of distrust that generated, he relied heavily on the artists to help him get the work out of his studio and out of Chicago into other places. And that's what they did. And they were helpful. They benefited from it from the standpoint of discounts. He gave them discounts. He offered them a percentage, and none of them wanted to be a dealer. So there is a kind of commercial part to the story, but it ends pretty quickly during his lifetime. He only had that one experience, and he didn't quite understand, in a way, the relationship of commerce to art. And he also didn't understand even something as simple as an honorarium. I mean, when Richard Frankel tried to pay him $150 for the privilege of showing his work at Penn State, he literally had to force him to take it. He really didn't understand. He thought he wanted something.
The misunderstanding of the relationship between art and commerce is probably not something that's specific to Joseph Yoakum. I can definitely say that.
No.
It's like, how about all of us in this case? I wanted to get to the work because what we're talking about leads into it. The way I knew Yoakum, or the thing that struck me first about him, was that he gives us a kind of travelogue of the world. And he claimed to have visited all the places that he drew. And if you look for photographic confirmation of these places, you may well be barking up the wrong tree. But I'm very interested in what is it that he was thinking? What is the role of specific places in his work? Seems to me quite ambiguous and really fascinating, as a matter of fact. I'm interested in your sense of sort of how this whole idea of travel and identifying specific locations, which is kind of what his work is all about, has to do with kind of the intentions of his work. What was he really after? Did he really visit these places?
Lyle, I think there's two ways. This goes back to the last question and into this one as well. I think there's two ways to look at this field. One is the infrastructure that the non-artists build around the artist, and that's sort of become the field. Then there's the information that comes from and about the actual artist. And I think what has been left out with Yoakum up till now was the non-infrastructure aspects. And if you go into the context of the culture that Yoakum grew up in, I think that you get more of the answers to these drawings. Number one, in Halstead's thing, he mentions that his mother was an herbalist and a doctor. She was also an ex-slave. Now, doctor is a hoodoo conjure classic term for someone who heals, works with herbs, was a midwife. And so he grew up with that kind of consciousness, and that consciousness has to do with a sense of place also. Mm-hmm. And what that became later on was what we call the yard show and what I call the spirit yard, where there's a sense of land, and land symbolically representing the culture. And I don't think Yoakum ever rejected his African-American background. I think that deflection is different than rejection.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
As a way of dealing with it, it was easier to speak to himself as a Native American than it was as a Black person to white people. And I think I had a question that leads into the rest of my answer on this. Did he title the drawings after he drew them?
That's what all of the artists who I've spoken to who knew him said. And in fact, we have quite a few works from Whitney Halstead's collection that do not have titles.
See, that I find that really significant.
Absolutely.
That means that, in a sense, as with other artists who sort of are in this genre, these are visions. They're active visions, whether they're dreams, whether they're visions, whatever words are used for them, which he then later goes over, and they serve as almost mnemonic devices for these visions and for these purposes, and then he names them. And I think that that we have to accept that these drawings as him consciously and in the now interacting with these visions. And I think that's what the drawings are. And to continuously try and match them up with their titles, I think is really, it's irrelevant almost. It's not important because he had the maps, and he had all those guides, and for him that was secondary. Maybe that was for you and me even, but maybe the drawings themselves, I think, were a whole different story. And I think that they come very much from the context of this of this African Atlantic religion that was a major part of the South and is now desacralized and known as hoodoo, but was a lot more important when he was growing up, and which his mother and his family was involved in. And I think the drawings are direct outreadings of that environment.
Mark and Esther, I'm interested again in getting your perspective on this. This triggers some thoughts for me, but we'll get to those in a minute. But I'm really interested in, again, this idea of place, how the drawings are imagined, and that really significant fact that they're often titled after the fact. And Yoakum was clear about that when he was asked, he was asked on a number of occasions whether he'd seen all these places. He said, well, sometimes, they are a spiritual remembrance after the fact. And I'm curious about how the two of you think about these drawings. How you characterize them to yourself.
I thought Randall's comments were like dead on and incredibly. I think often what's been interesting, again, coming at it from MoMA, is that you have to recognize the spirituality and the faith that underlies these works. And that's not typically something we bring to our galleries, which are historically and to a certain extent now seen as really secular places where God or none of that, religion stuff comes into play. And so finding a way to channel that or to explain that in a way that allows our visitors to connect with it, I think is really important. I think for me, what is fascinating is I think Randall is right. Like the image came first, and then Yoakum himself says there's this spiritual remembrance, which allows him to name the place. But the names are so specific, and they're like lengthy and full of detail, which makes you want to take them both at face value and also as somehow critical to understanding. And of course, the simplest of Google searches immediately shows kind of the flaws there. But for me, both that naming of place and the insistence that he had been to these places is also caught up in the idea of legacy formation. Like Yoakum, this is him at the end of his life deciding how he wants to be perceived, the record he wants to leave from about his life, and also a way of almost like claiming ownership and claiming agency in all of these places. And he probably had been to many of them, but who knows the context in which that would have happened, or what the experience would have been like, especially as a man of color trying to move through the US in the beginning of the 20th century. So for me, a lot of this is the story that he wants to present of his life. And I always say, like, you have to go with him there in order to like really connect with the work. You have to believe what he's telling you, even if, it was hard at a certain point working on the show to be like, well, where's the document? Like, where's the thing? Because you're used to searching for the proof, and they're just, this is the proof. So.
Yeah, that's why I like to say that the picture tells the story, and even without the title, you get it. And I agree with Esther. I think Randall, you're dead on in your interpretation of these things, and a rationale for the relationship between picture and text. And I guess my entry point into these drawings is always to see them laid bare. And there's one slide, if we can get to it. You asked for it, Lyle.
Yes.
It's the
from
one
the
of
notebooks.
Blue ballpoint pen. It's not actually from a notebook, but it's blue ballpoint pen. If we could just forward to that slide, we could talk about that for a minute. Is that possible?
See. Yeah. We just have to. Is that the one from Vermont? Is that
there's no.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
That's it.
That is a notebook drawing, actually.
No, it's not.
It isn't. I'm wrong.
It's not. It's funny because it's in that section of the catalog. No, it's
right. I'm sorry.
It's a free sheet, and it's the kind of really beautiful, crappy stationery that he liked drawing on that has a kind of fake linen texture. I've gone back to this drawing over and over and over again because it really represents when people say, where did he start? How did he start? How did a drawing progress? I think this is how they started. And I think that's the reason why Whitney kept it rather than throwing it out. It gives us all the evidence we need to kind of understand perhaps the first touch, Yoakum's feeling for the space of a piece of paper, the way that things came together and were embellished with pattern and other kinds of marks. And this is like the start of all of the project right here. It has pockets, it has linearity, it has undulation, it has a movement or the implied movement. It's everything except for a title. And that is why I've always thought that, the titles are important, but at the same time, they're misleading. I agree that the fact that he had an atlas in his studio, he had an encyclopedia in his studio, those are all fine. I think sometimes maybe he consulted them to get the spelling right. I don't know. But,
or not.
Or not. Yeah, exactly. Where he thought he could spell it phonetically, he
Right.
did it that way.
You're right.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't know the guy, but I think this is it. This is like ground zero right here.
Yeah, I felt the same way about the notebooks. They were a total revelation to me. And I want to go back to the show, which will be up until March 19th. I urge you all to go see it if you haven't seen it. I really wanted to spend more time thinking about those notebooks because I feel the way you guys do, that it really is kind of, this is not, like you say, it's not a notebook drawing, but I'm haunted by the picture of him in the hospital late in his life, and he's making pictures. He doesn't have access to sources, right? Obviously no internet, but he doesn't have even his stuff. And he's in the hospital and he's got notebooks and he's drawing. And he's also titling or partially titling work as he goes. And there's something incredibly moving about that, and also really revealing, just for the reasons that you've been talking about. It's really that energy coming from the drawings that kind of motivates them and motivates him when he's in the hospital. But I wanted to complicate our discussion even a little more. Can we go to the picture of the tornado for a minute?
Yep.
And pull that up. That's the one we just had up on screen, if we can do that. Yeah, that's one of the ones. One of the things that's very interesting, and you guys alluded to it, and I wonder if you talk a little bit more about this. Esther, you were talking about, in terms of location or geography, taking ownership, okay? Which I think is an intriguing way to think about it. Randall, you were talking about a kind of spiritualization of place. And these are, as you said, these are kind of vision drawings, where it's not about the places particularly, but about a kind of evocation or a kind of experience that the artist is rendering. At the same time, there are these, let's call them historical drawings. I don't know if that's the right word. This is my favorite. This is one of the ones that really jump out at me. And that is the cyclone that struck Susanville, California. I don't know if there was a cyclone in Susanville, California in 1903. I have no idea. But I know what this picture is about. And there are a few pictures like this. I mean, there are portraits which we're not going to deal with, at least that opens up a whole other set of issues that I don't think we have time for. But this drawing strikes me as going to the heart of something that Yoakum is thinking about. And I wonder if you guys have specific comments about this drawing, especially, and about the fact that it appears to deal with a historical event, something he doesn't often do, but does from time to time.
You know, Robert Ferris Thompson used to say that too. And
by the way, who died, I just want to say that Robert Ferris Thompson, who's a great commentator and writer about self-taught art and the African diaspora, died this year. And it was a great, incredible loss, I think, for all of us.
I'll be curating a show dedicated to him at House Saint-Pierre in Paris in 2023 that sort of deals with a lot of this. But what he was what I learned from him and what he was most into was this idea of the yard show. And a yard show post-slavery, freed slaves were given property, and then it was basically taken away by Jim Crow and for many other reasons. But place became extremely important. And the yard of these houses that remained and the yards that are still there now became abstract vessels of remembrance. So very, very symbolic things were placed in the yard, and they were all about remembrance. They were about self-aggrandizement. They were about amuletic behavior and things given. So in a sense, these drawings are his vehicles of remembrance, and they fit right into the whole yard show thing of remembrance. And so I find it's totally legitimate that there will be some actual real pieces that go through his mind also, as well as the visionary things. I mean, he's not going to be on all the time. Not every Jimi Hendrix solo was a killer, you know. But I think it keeps coming back to remembrance, but remembrance being getting its energy from the land and from place. And I don't think he ever lost that.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautifully said, Randall. Also, it's funny, in looking at this drawing as you're talking about it, like where the cyclone appears to be hitting almost feels like it would be like the yard, you know, of this structure. For me, anytime you get anything that requires straight lines and a grid in Yoakum is like secondary in nature. And to me, this is like the perfect example of his kind of like disdain for mankind wrecking kind of nature and the beauty of the natural world. So you have this like, you know, it's just kind of being swept off to the side there by incredible forces, which weirdly feel like dark and which in theory are dark and destructive, but to me don't necessarily feel that way in this drawing.
Well, in that regard, can we go to another slide that to me makes that link? In other words, I agree with you 100%. There's something really, I hate to say celebratory about that, but it's a profound recognition that what's happening in a picture like this is actually no different from what's happening in other landscapes in other places. So can we go to the one that's on the cover of the catalog, which is the one from Vermont? It's a dark blue one. It's really, really astonishing picture. I'm not sure which number it is in our lineup, but it's a killer image, and it to many ways is to me a kind of bookend for this tornado picture. Yeah, this is it. Those two energies that we're talking about, a kind of energy of the line that kind of epitomizes the landscape or embodies the Yoakum sense of what places are all about, and then the kind of natural forces that can be unleashed. It seems to me that those kind of form a kind of unity. I'm just wondering how you guys kind of respond to, and I guess Randall's response was really good, that they're really kind of formal of a piece. But Mark, I'm really interested in your senses of sort of like where the spiritual dimension really resides for these pictures, or what it means.
You're asking the wrong guy, man. I'm an atheist. I don't get into spirituality at all. But what I would say about this picture is that there is an astonishing level of comparison between the liquid nature of water and what he does with the landscape. And we're here, he's got it reversed. The landscape is liquid and the liquid is stable, or it's stationary. It's just like fabulous and bizarre in every way. That's what I love about it. It's a kind of reversal of expectation.
It's also where the animism comes in. Because the basic tenet of animism is that a stone is alive. So by his energetic lines, what he's doing is breathing life into it, what we see as inanimate objects that he doesn't necessarily see as inanimate. I mean, that's the word, inanimate.
Any thoughts about any other thoughts about this? I have actually a slide, Esther. Any other thoughts about that? You introduced a dirty word, okay, in terms of sort of critical discourse, I think, and we may be coming out of that. This is why I was really intrigued to have Randall as part of this discussion, and that is what Mark just kind of demurred on, which is the whole idea of kind of trying to deal with sort of spirituality in works of art, and there are many ways in which that can show up, obviously, but when we have a discussion of a work where words like spirituality come up as a way of illuminating the work, there's a lot of people who run in the other direction. And to some degree, I'm one of those people, so I sympathize with Mark. But Esther, I wonder if you could just expound on that just for a few minutes about what about bringing some awareness of spirituality or some maybe more sophisticated notion of how it's represented into our discussions of current work.
Sure. I think, and again, this is just me, but I think a discomfort with, and I say spirituality as opposed to like religion, because really I'm not talking about like organized religion per se. I'm just talking about that sense of connection with a higher being in whatever form or shape it takes. The inability of modern and contemporary art history to deal with that is what in some ways has kept us from recognizing, just to name a few, like a huge portion of the African-American creative community, because of course,
Absolutely.
religion and the Black church, like there's so much that's going on there where if you're unwilling to deal with like the presence of Christ, you can't, like you literally can't engage with those works. So my interest in that kind of field really came from my interest in like looking at Charles White and the community he's coming out of and what his connection with various kind of churches was, or looking at someone like Betty Saar is a perfect example because she has this other, these really otherworldly connections, spiritually speaking, which I just felt completely unprepared to deal with from kind of classic curatorial art history perspectives. So to me, like, you know, these are broad, faith and spirituality are huge areas that connect like all of us, whatever side you fall on, so kind of have to be at the heart of everything. For Yoakum in particular, what's so interesting to me is that you get this kind of like earthly animism and spirituality in the lands, but then he used this like really specific language tied, which everyone recognized was tied to Christian Science, but Christian Science is like not I have actually met in the course of talking about this exhibition more practicing Christian Scientists than ever before in my life, but it was not like a religion I knew very much about. People still mix it up with Scientology on a regular basis, like vastly different practices. And so it was just fascinating to me that everyone knew there was this connection, but we had never really dug into what that was.
And I'm really interested in that as well. Something that comes up in the, again, we have limited time to do this, which is really a shame. But it comes up in the titles all the time. Obviously, the language he used, which is, again, a kind of way of conceptualizing what he was all about, right, as an artist. And I think that artists are always looking for languages that somehow are appropriate to what they're doing. That I'm not just talking about visual languages, but ways of kind of conceiving or conceptualizing or talking about what they do. And Yoakum's work, the more I think about Christian Science, and the catalog is really important for this, the more I had to recognize that Yoakum has done what many, many great artists have done, which is to borrow a vocabulary that suited his imaginative outlook. In a way, he found the right words to, to title his pictures and to get a sense of sort of why they made sense. And to me, that's it's really powerful. And it also says a lot about where the work was coming from.
isn't it just as likely, though, that he had a churchical interpretation of the world, that as you say, the Christian Science book gave him the words for, but he also came from the Black church. And Black Christian Science isn't going to be like white Christian Science.
Absolutely.
And the language, I mean, how I was curious as how we actually know, other than the use of the word enfoldment and the presence of that book in his room and the possible seeing of newspapers by someone later on, how do we actually know that he was a Christian Scientist? Or did he just use the language because
Well, that's what I think.
that it gave him a mode of expression?
Yeah,
I mean,
I think you're right, Lyle. I think that, or Randall, I think that he was not like, Christian Science, much like, I would say different than other religions, is something I think you have to be a registered member of. And he was certainly not a registered member of the Christian Science Church. And frankly, I wondered just how much he was actually reading and using Eddie's text, because I had trouble with it myself. So I think there was a lot, more than we realize now, a lot of popular Christian Science theory on the radio, on TV. He lived near that church. So I think Lyle sensed that he was taking what was useful and applying it to the work where he found it, is more likely than him being like a registered service attending member of the Christian Science Church.
Card-carrying member. No, he wasn't. I don't think he was that.
It's similar with Trailer late in life, turning to Catholicism. Nothing in his work really indicates Catholicism, except, there's a couple of crucifixions, but that doesn't necessarily mean Catholicism. But I mean, sometimes these are just in the veneer and not in the depth.
Right. But it's never, okay, this is a more elaborate discussion, but it's never entirely just in the veneer. I mean, as we said before, you pick the things that it's not just totally opportunistic. You pick the things that resonate. And sometimes those things are deep and sometimes they're not. But usually there's a connection being made. And that's what intrigues me about the Christian Science thing. You take what's useful, you take what makes a certain amount of sense.
The unfoldment.
The unfoldment, for example, what he got that. He definitely got that. I want to, before they cut us off and they give us the cut sign, I did want to bring up one more slide, something I've been thinking a lot about, and I just want to put it in front of you. A question I asked earlier, which is why Yoakum now? Why do we need to look at these drawings, or what do they have to tell us about, say, our moment? I want to go to this slide that I added, which is a Chinese painting from the 1000s. It's a Shanshui painting. And I'm not going to parse this and give a whole history of it, but it's Guoxi. This painting comes out of, or is very much part of, a tradition of landscape representation in China, connected to Taoism and Confucianism. And I've been thinking a lot about work like this, especially in the context of our relationship to the natural environment and the concern about that, and the discussion around how artists engage that. And when I had a chance to go back to Yoakum this time around, after thinking about Chinese painting and a tradition called Shanshui of relationship to the natural environment and how it's represented, I suddenly was started to make connections that maybe might be important for our thinking, both as artists and as just human beings, about our relationship to the natural environment. And again, it's a stretch, and I understand that, but I want to go back to that question. Does Yoakum have something to inspire us with, or to teach us about our relationship to the natural world? Maybe not, but it's a question that I have, and these paintings started to suggest that as well. The Chinese tradition has a very different relationship to rendering the natural world primarily than Western art. And I was seeing things that Yoakum was concerned with very much reflected in a quite different tradition of representation. One that's much more spiritualized, one that functions through a series of commitments by the artist to very, very personal experiences of the landscape and to memory, all the things that we've been talking about, so that it renders a kind of landscape that's been processed through kind of a spiritual and cosmological understanding. And can Yoakum teach us things? Can he inspire us in our relationships with the natural world to see things differently? Or maybe I'm just being a Pollyanna about this.
I've never really considered those connections, Lyle, but I think that you're right. I think that you said the word that brought up the idea of a cosmology to me. And I think that Yoakum's drawings are filled with it. And so is this example. And there's also a hierarchy within the picture that alludes to some of the ideas
Absolutely.
that you expressed. And I think that Yoakum's drawings do the same thing. And for him, it was something that happened very quickly and almost innately. I mean, one of the questions we haven't talked about is development. Is it necessary
absolutely.
to talk about development? But I've had this discussion with several of the artists, and they all felt like he developed very quickly. He developed his language very, very quickly, and
so did Van Gogh, for that matter.
So there's an impulsive, inherent property, and I think it goes back to maybe many of the things that Randall has offered about his connection to his life early on in the South, and his mother, and conjuring, and all of his other ideas. But it's in him. The drawings are really a reflection of him. I think of them as a self-portrait, like an ongoing epic self-portrait. And it's because that's what he had. You look at the pictures of people and it's a whole different game. So I think of the landscapes as people, but the person is him. And even the way that he designs them, you're at ground level at the bottom looking in, almost like a postcard view. And so he's inviting you he's placing you in the same place that he is. I think it's the fact that that's very regular in his pictures speaks to that idea, I think. So I don't disagree with you at all. I don't have the same language for it, but I sense it.
I think
which is how I felt about it as well. Esther, any thoughts about this? I have a bunch of quotes about Shanshui from various commentators over the last 1,000 years, but I'm not going to bore you with those. Any thoughts from you about that kind of, maybe the relevance of Yoakum now? I'm haunted by the fact that we need more Yoakum. We need to understand what he offers us, just the way we need to understand what this tradition of painting offers us. And that's quite different from standard Western, you might say, perspectival approaches to the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think your comparison is an incredible one, not the least because of the way that some of the washes of ink and the change in tone show up, in the way that Yoakum really masterfully handles that in some cases with watercolor, no less, which is like quite tricky to do, I think. But for me, just thinking about an artist who's working in Chicago, and again, who knows what he was looking at or what he had seen in terms of art history, but to focus solely on landscape and not the natural landscape at a moment when he's living kind of in a brick box in urban air, like that idea
Absolutely.
of choosing to dedicate oneself to the natural landscape that way. And the fact that, it's funny when you go through, when we were putting together the checklist, I think one of the most critical things was to show just how different the works are, even with a vocabulary of like 8 or 9 different forms, repeating locations again and again, the incredible range of different things he's doing in the work to represent kind of a breadth and kind of endless changing and diversity in the world, I think draws attention to. I mean, when was the last time you saw a landscape show at MoMA? Like ever, like it's just that idea of having someone in the moment that
absolutely. I mean, and landscape shows are, these days they're going to be all photographic, mostly. And it's like, if you want a definition of the anti-photograph. You're looking at it right here, it seems to me.
Is there
one
a
of the things
slide of the weeping pebble? The weeping pebble?
Do we have the weeping pebble in this? I don't know if we do. I don't
I
think
don't
we.
think so, but my personal favorite's Randall.
I think those
That's
things
why I'm
are-
laughing.
I think those things are really, really significant because in a sense, that's him actually adding a yard show thing to the landscape. And I should have asked for one of those slides. I apologize, but I think that's very significant to what you're talking about because it shows him interacting finally with that landscape also.
Right, as do the titles in their own different ways, you know. But that's obviously the placement of an object in that world,
Yeah.
that he's creating, and it's really, that's fascinating. One of the things I'm just going to quote before we finish. I know we have an audience that has lots of questions, and I want time for that. But one of the commentators on Shen Shui painting, and I can't remember who it is. I didn't make a note about which sage it was, but said pathways should never be straight. They should meander like a stream. And there is this not straightness about Yoakum's world that kind of opens up how we move into those pictures. And once we get there, I think it's really, really important for us to examine how we feel when we're there. And maybe that's what I'm looking for in terms of sort of what he can offer us in sort of inspiring us vis-a-vis the natural world. Anyway, maybe that's a good place to open it up to questions. Is that okay? Is that good for you, Nick, or everybody else's? Because we do want to hear some questions for sure.
Yeah, for sure. We can definitely go for some audience questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for your discussion. It was really, really wonderful to hear. Our first question is from Michael Noland, who unfortunately he did have to leave a bit early today. So I'll just ask it kind of on his behalf. So here's the question in Michael's words. He said, as a longtime fan of Yoakum's work, I wonder if the panel might have thoughts about how the Imagist and Harry, who included him in many shows as an equal. He's not sure if this has been done before, but he wanted to know about that.
I'm not sure what the question is. What's the question?
Just if there were thoughts, maybe we can put it in should we put it in the chat, Nick?
I think my sense is Mark is asking if the works have ever been shown, like if one were to do a
landscape show,
or like essentially not Nelson were some.
Well, Mike, I know Mike is from Chicago, and
right.
He knows that's true. He knows that that's a fact, that they did include him. I mean, Jim Nutt and Gladys Nilsson included him in a show at the candy store, and made a poster for it in which Yoakum is the key figure, and his silhouette is like the subject of the poster. Mm-hmm. So they definitely saw him, if not as just as an equal, but as someone even beyond. I mean, to this day, Jim Nutt still has extremely deep feelings for Yoakum. I know that this exhibition has been something that he also looked forward to, as you and Randall did. And in fact, several years ago, when I was teasing him about it, he said, if you ever do this show during my lifetime, I hope you're able to get Momo to take it because he deserves it. So it's, significant. They loved him. They loved him and respected him.
Mm-hmm. And I think in broader terms, I mean, it's been ongoing for 100 and some years. That is the integration of so-called outsider work with the work of trained artists, and talk about exhibitions. We're talking about institutions that do that. But I think we really have, and I see it all over the place. Maybe it's a generational shift, I'm not sure, but it's very clear that there is a different awareness about kind of what the subject is, and how you deal with a subject in terms of a curating activity, and the cordoning off of certain kinds of works in different areas. It's not that that's over, but it's very, very clear that institutions that are, or curators that are most concerned with helping us understand the nature of art are just not interested in those kinds of academic distinctions, that is, in enforcing them, okay? Sometimes those distinctions are relevant, sometimes not, but they're certainly not interested in cordoning off any kind of work. And I don't know, we have two curators here. I don't know how you feel about that, but I see it in your own thinking.
Lyle, you have to awaken the demon of intentionality, because Yoakum and people like that are not making work with the same intentionality.
I understand.
So that is going to, but a lot of people feel that you cannot even, how do you even get into what someone's intentionality is? And that's always been the wall that no one goes past. But when you're dealing with a culture has an intentionality. And if you understand the individual's relationship to that culture, then you can understand where their intentionality is coming from. But there are differentiations. You can put a trailer up on a wall next to an Edward Hopper, and they're going to look incredible, but they're both up there with two entirely different intentionalities.
Understood.
I don't know if that's the case, though, for Yoakum in the same way, given that his work is seen in the first place because he's hanging it in his window. And so I always argue, like, if he wasn't interested in having people see it and engage with it, then
it's the intention about making it.
Right.
Why he made it, not how he presents it.
Right. Right.
You know, so there's a difference. He made it for a different reason than someone who's answering to a question of art history or their place in the canon.
I mean, it's hard to know, though, what any artist, and I don't know. For me, that's also like making a certain set of assumptions about trained artists as well, and why they make their work. So it kind of, it goes both ways.
Well, that's the demon.
Yeah, to go back to your initial question, Lyle, I would say no. I'm not interested in segregating any of this stuff, and I never liked the term outsider. I mean, he's an artist. To me, he's always been an artist. I've approached him as an artist. I saw him as an artist from the very first time I saw a box full of unmatted drawings just floating around. I mean, it has everything that I look for, hope for in a work of art, and so I don't isolate him as being somehow different. He is different, but I don't isolate him that way. I see him in a continuum with other art.
Great.
I want to move on to another question, but I do want to say, in response to Randall, there are some really, really important things to work out about exactly what you're saying. And it's something that I go round and round about. There are distinctions to be made. There's no question about that. But there are also connections to be made. And
Absolutely.
Doing both of those that's our job.
That's why outsider never worked as a word. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Our next question will be coming from GE. GE, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you, Eleanor, and everyone. Circling back a little bit to some of the things we've already touched, but I want to take it even further because I think there's something specific that might be added to this. Can we see this practice of visualizing and rendering these images, and this practice of the spiritual unfolding that we talked about? It's that conversation, it's kind of a conversation with the divine, which we know is rooted in Christian Science, whether or not he was an active practitioner or not. But there's also these offshoots of Christian Science that was practiced by some African Americans, where they were involved in astral projection, which was visualizing things from other places and bringing them back and using that as part of the work of unfolding. And it was wondering if there was anybody that ever looked into that or has any feeling about that in terms of Yoakum.
I haven't.
Me either, and I would love to know more about this African-American specific astral plane connection. That's not a practice.
Me too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's part of the backyard work in some ways too, that
Yeah.
you were talking about earlier. So it's about those rituals and things.
Where is
Yeah.
that documented?
Well, I experienced it personally when I lived in Albany for many years. I knew some Black Christian scientists who actually practiced it as part of their practice. So it's a personal thing.
Yeah, I was super intrigued. For example, there are two pictures in our lineup, or one or two, of flying saucers that that look like dirigibles, right? They have propellers and stuff. And at first, when I first saw those, I thought, yeah, this is kind of funny. It's amusing. I've been thinking a lot more about those pictures as well over the last couple of months.
Lori
they're intriguing.
hilariously referred to them as unidentified flying pagodas.
Yeah, right.
And aren't those prompted by the experience he says he has on the airplane being forced down by one? At one point,
Right, that's how it came up in conversation with
Right,
me.
exactly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Our next question will be from Jeffrey Wolf. Jeffrey Wolf, if you wanna, where are you, Jeffrey? There you are. If you just wanna unmute to ask your question, you should be able to at this point.
Dude, unmute.
You have to, there you are.
I mean, okay.
All right.
I mean, I'm interested in the show. There's a display
Mhm.
that has all his marks shown. And I'm curious how you all think he referred to these in meaning that, is that something that sets him apart or makes him more like other artists? And also the idea of stenciling that he did.
Yeah, right, as a technique or practice.
I'm wondering your thoughts about that, because these are things. I mean, you see the repeated forms in Ramirez and other artists, but I'm curious what you think about that in relationship to Yoakum. And the stenciling is very different. Mark, are you there?
When you say stenciling, do you mean copying?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, the marks being categorized that you're talking about, that was Phil Hansen in a term paper that he wrote for a class with Whitney that he had. So it's an artist who is discerning that. And so it's like an artist looking, pardon?
That was back in 62. It was really early on, was it not?
No, it was 68 or 9, I believe.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's all right.
So it was later.
Nobody knew him in 62. None of these people knew him in 62. Allegedly, that's when he started drawing. His first exhibition at the Hole was 1967. So,
okay.
Anyway, so that's one thing. And what, Jeffrey, I'm sorry, the other part of your question.
Well, I mean, him coming up with that in his paper is one thing, but
copying.
How he actually used that, because when you look at the drawings, it feels, like there's even one where he kind of has the whole shape of the drawing mapped out, and then he takes these individual marks and he seems to have placed them in. And it's kind of like what Randall talked about, giving a title to something after he draws it. I'm kind of curious about the process.
Well, he referred to, he was asked about his use of the copyright symbol on his drawings, which he used sometimes. And one of his responses that Whitney recorded was that he was very concerned about being copied and not being given credit for his patterning. He was very attuned to the idea of a pattern, apparently. And I'm just taking this from the literature, from what I've read. And so his use of a copying mechanism was really to prevent his initial drawing in black and white or in black pen or blue pen from getting out into the world, although he let quite a few of them out into the world, nevertheless. Interestingly, you know, despite his concern about the copywriting, we now know that, of course, that fashion house in Paris is using his drawings to make clothing with and paying nobody. You know, he never got paid for that, sadly. So that's recent. That's within the last year. I don't know if everybody's seen that, but it's no, kind of,
I haven't seen.
I mean, they're kind of beautiful garments, but it's disgusting to me that they're being used. His drawings are being used that way. They also had a Martin Ramirez line, which I'm sure some of you must have seen. I mean, it's bizarre.
Yeah, I have seen. I've seen online. I've seen it.
Yeah,
there's a Bill trailer line also from a different company. But go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, and to move on to the stenciling, sometimes, you know, I just saw the Jasper John show, and the whole idea of mirroring, and the stenciling often feels like mirroring.
Absolutely, he does it with the UFO. You know, you saw that the two drawings in the show, one is going one way and one is going the other. And the slide that I sent in, which came from Cynthia Carlson, you know, there's a drawing that she used to own, shows it in its original guise. And so I think, I can't remember how it goes. It's either Roger Brown's drawing of the UFO is copied from our drawing or vice versa. So it's like he made several layers of copying. And that's fascinating also, that he would do that. So we don't have any carbon paper. Unfortunately, our conservator really wished that we'd had carbon paper so she could look at it. But she also discovered drawings incised by pressure into the backs of drawings that were the drawing that, you know, he drew on top of. And so, you know, we know that he drew in a stack sometimes and transferred the marks by pressure. He never developed those drawings, however. I've never seen one that was developed.
You know, when we do these big, well, this is how I always feel, when you do big shows like this one that cover the whole arc of a artist's career, you always feel like it then launches like 1,000 more shows. So I think there's a small focus show to be done, like lining up for, like, we have 2 more rough drawings, and there was a 3rd version in the David Werner Carter collection exhibition, actually. So the idea of looking at the 3 versions really closely to see what changed and what was the same. You know, there was a lot of, I think, artistic development and license taken, even in things that were purportedly copied. So I think someone at some point will make some interesting discoveries or points about that.
Yeah, and we look forward to it.
Me too. I wanted to jump in on this and maybe kind of just, it's a total red herring, but thinking about Randall and what he's been saying, you know, one of the things that's fascinating to me about looking at Shan Shui painting is it's all rule-based, or it appears to be. That is, there's commentators and there's manuals and there's constant commentary about how you should do certain things, but don't do this, but do this, and how it should look. But in fact, it's really coming from the artists themselves. And they have, within that tradition, the gestures have a meaning. What you do is symbolic, it's reflective, it's philosophical. And the thing that's interesting to me about Yoakum is, yes, we can do these techniques where we identify what he's up to. And this maybe gets to Jeffrey's question, but what did they mean to him? And I think that that's where we still have some thinking to do, because yes, okay, it's a repertoire of techniques, but those techniques in the context of his work probably clearly had significance. A certain kind of line as opposed to another kind of line. I don't know that. I don't know what the dictionary is on that, but it just feels like that there's another level behind those gestures and we're kind of flirting with that. At least some of the commentary that I've read, it certainly in the catalog, we put this stuff out there. We're not really sure how Yoakum thought about it and how important it was in the construction of his own work. I'm super interested in these. It's not just an academic exercise, obviously.
It's also about work. I mean, the way, that's what he did. That was his job. And in a sense, it's his trade. And so it becomes as much about the process as it does the end result also. This is what he's doing, and how he's staying alive is by being an artist, is by the selling of the work is part of that trade. It has a different meaning for third world countries than it might mean for someone to sell the work here. But I think it was a self-affirmant to be an artist. And that could be the reason right there. You know, it says, this is what I do. I make this work. It's what I do. Maybe no more than that.
Interesting to think about and debate, though.
Yes. I always leave that open.
Yeah. Yeah, I often think that the simplest answer is usually the true answer. But it's also wonderful to be contemplating it and throwing it out there verbally to see what, how it fits with other people's concept. Yeah, I don't think obviously we'll never know. I mean, he would never really even answer questions to the artist about how he went about making the things, and he never let anybody watch him make a drawing that we know of.
That seems really important for maybe just for what Randall's saying. It's like, I got to protect my stuff, but maybe there are other reasons behind that as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. We will now pass the mic over to Keith for our final audience question before we turn it over to the director of the rail.
Oh, hi. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Just basically, I was wondering if the artist ever used better materials later on in his life. I've only learned of him recently, and I'm getting more used to his work. So that was my question in general.
No. We only know of a couple of drawings that he made on Japanese paper that probably would have been provided to him by Whitney Halstead. But Whitney talked about walking him through the museum from time to time to go to the school store to buy supplies. But he always seemed to have drawn on, after he gave up newsprint, he always seemed to draw on basic artist student grade white drawing paper of the same type and size.
And I love that.
Deviating.
Yeah, I love that because that's basic to the artist. It's like, yeah, I could do it on anything, but this is what I like. Okay, right. This is what I like.
The touch.
Excellent. If none of our guests have anything to add to that question, to the answer to that question, we'll now pass the mic over to the wonderful artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, Phong Bui.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you. Thank you, Randall. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Mark and Lyle. Amazing conversation as usual. I learned a lot, definitely, and I know my friend Cynthia Carson have collected Yoakum for a long time. So I first discovered the collection there in probably I would say late 90s, so fairly recent. Although I've seen here and there, but never, many all at once in her collection. But I have a question in thinking about, I'm glad that you show the Chinese landscape early on, Lyle. And I kept thinking about that whole relationship in Chinese poetry, as it is in painting. It's very integrated, because the idea, I was telling Carl just now, my assistant, how the word Zen originated. It's the same word in Chinese Chan, which is to contemplate, and where in China, if you want to get away from the artificial construct of the urban environment, you go to contemplate nature. You can walk mile and mile, you don't see anyone. And then you would basically internalize, breathe in the whole vista of the landscape. Only after you come home, you meditate, and then you create the painting. Because anything that is close to copying nature is considered inferior, even vulgar to one's sensibility. So when it comes to Japan, the whole migration of Buddhism changed so much, because Japan being so small as an island. So if you go to contemplate nature, more or less, once you get a ride to the top of the mountain, there's probably tons of people there already picnicking. So nature has to be internalized from within. It's very interesting. So I wonder in Yoakum's early formation, whether he had any strong, relationship to transcendental poetry or any form of poetry that had somehow associated in his own thinking. Any of you, Randall, Mark, Esther?
No idea.
No idea.
Given that we do know the kind of limited educational opportunity and kind of experience he would have had, I doubt he would have had exposure in any kind of formal setting, but it's interesting to think about places where he might have, people read poetry all over, where he might have engaged with that out in the world.
Right.
There's poetry within the culture.
Within the culture, right.
Right.
Yeah, story, and in a sense, I mean, I think we can all agree that to some degree Yoakum was a storyteller.
Absolutely.
And in Roger Abrams' Man of Words, the telling of stories has a cultural place. And I would say that and local characters and people within the community, it's more of a roots culture, of a roots poetry. I would say that it could come from there, that would be a relationship. But as far as formal poetry, I don't see where it would have come from. Or church. I mean, there's psalms and things like that.
Right. What about, is any, I mean, this is the question to you all, including you, Cynthia, who's in the audience. Do you think, since there's an incredible strong systematized order in which the gesture, the mark making is highly masterfully created, do you think there's a reference to at all that from our perspective, looking back to the roots of an early American dark vein romantic tradition, whether it's Melville way down to Albert Pinkham Ryder, Forrest Bass. I mean, it's very interesting that some people have, brought this up, because I'm thinking of so many painters I know, for example, Bill Jensen at the moment, and certainly Gregory Amanoff. When I look at their works, I see Yoakum influence, from my own eye, my own reception, but I'm not so sure whether it's conscious, but I think it certainly rolls some parallels. And I just I'm curious whether you all have run into that kind of parallels or, pairing, so to speak.
Well, Amanoff collected Yoakum.
Right.
Yes.
So,
right. Great. Well, that answers everything. And you know what is so interesting too? I might share with you all. I spent some time with Terry Winters and his wife, Handel Steichen, years ago, and I also discovered there's a large collection of James Castle. And my friend Chris Morton collect Lonnie Holly, who's a friend, Horton Dyer and other artists. And I mean, I know that Joe Bradley is crazy about William Hawkins. I'm just naming a few.
And Jeffrey Way, who is in the audience, also is a music collector.
Right. Terrific. Pleased to meet you. Thank you, you guys. I just want to share you lastly, I'm undertaking a huge show in May, and it will roll out until October as a way to celebrate the Rail 22nd year anniversary. And the show initially was entitled roughly The Thought and the Self-Taught in Democratic Vista, but I changed my mind this morning. So it's going to be called, because of this division that we all detest so much, it's going to be called Singing in Unison, artists need to create on the same scale that society has the capacity to destroy. So I'm pushing out to you all. I can't wait to put a Thornton dial next to Julian Schnabel, and Yoakum, Amanov. And so it's going to go on and on and on and on. And I'll be reaching out to you each for your advice, for your counsel, and can't wait for this show. It's going to be a healing gesture, I think. It's going to be 6, 7, maybe 10 different locations, non-profit and profit gallery. Yeah, so that's it. Back to you, Eleanor. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you so much, Fong. And of course, thanks again to our guests and our host. Here at the Rail, we have the tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Carolyn Funk, to the stage. Carolyn Funk is an artist and writer based in New York City. Her interdisciplinary practice includes photography, moving images, film criticism, and creative essays. She co-teaches the Cool Memories Cinema and Poetry course with poet Ben Fama and is the co-founder of Duel Films, an artist-run company producing films, podcasts, and critical texts. So without further ado, Carolyn, thank you so much. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And that was such a fantastic talk. I cannot wait to get to MoMA to see that exhibition ASAP. I have 5 short poems. And the first one, Pavement Butterfly. And this poem is actually in the shape of a cross. Pavement Butterfly. Frosted yellow willows, moon-faced lighting, kitty's eyebrows fixed in reverence. 86-degree interior infernal, thick bad air and repulsive machines. Walking home on Willoughby Avenue, dehydrated branches catch my ankles. Close to cameras, sirens, serpents, wretched, shadowy, inanimate eye, dead wood, mortal flicker, hard passion, fate, etc. Scratched carnation, hair flip, scales of pleasure, quasi-damned, metallic curtain, film too fast, too bound in rolls, too hot to live. Queen's position on winter solstice. The outline of a lady, more formless than ever, given the choice of poisonous shirt or eternal wheel, wears lossy eyeliner, eyes diner takeout, the icy evening. I get the sense you're not fit for walking. Why do you get that sense? A pretty stare, the contretemps, cross-eyed influence, your diagonal petrified plank. Computer vision. Safe house, script girl, sad media, dead hotel, archive scraps, claim credit, color blue, glass doors, Baltic waves, unearthly sounds, fenced theatrics, resilient mushrooms, micro budget, beautiful virus, married books, minute masteries, high heels, happy coding, hacked utopia, insect swarms, generic matrix, bad reception, camera over, paradise loss. To accept the void. A blackberry, spectral, of so many juicy pixels, a tiny void, poor spirit, liquid satin, little nothing. A desire impaired, universe, light. It is sweet, exposed in the palm of my hand. And the last poem is called Metaxu. Mid-city landscape, servers or slaves, flash memory and clear complexions, bluff Des Moines with anonymous digits, touch the moon through screens and searched by lower price. Arrange roses at street corners, slick streets, wet prisons, no receipts, bodies go the way of all flesh. Busted bitch, worn once, no souls in these shoes. Screen time, the technology of confession, portable organs in erotic communion. The cells of the flower are beautiful to look at. Thank you.
So lovely. Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was amazing. And thank you to Esther, Randall, Mark, and Lyle. And we would also like to thank Stephanie and the extended MoMA team for all your help to make today's event possible. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we will upload today's conversation shortly. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our 73rd Radical Poetry reading, curated by Vincent Katz and featuring poetry read by Benedicta Froelich, Eileen Miles, Trace Peterson, and Andre Cordescu. And you can now turn on your mics and just say hello and goodbye and thank you as you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
What a pleasure. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyle.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Lyle.
Mark.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Carolyn,
Randall.
so much for that
Thanks,
reading.
Esther.
Hey, Lyle.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Jeff.
Thank you,
Special
Carolyn.
show.
Mark, Esther.
Thanks, Esther.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Mark.
Randall.
Thanks a lot.
Esther, thank you so much, Randall. Thank you for your conversation. And go see the show now. It's very important to see the show. Okay?
Just go.
Second time, third time is definitely worth the visit. So long live Yoakum.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
reading. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fong.
God love you guys. Ciao.
Ciao.